The Putnams' Playbook. While the map was lying, the Putnams were writing. Their paper wasn't parchment. It was petitions, depositions, and writs, a stack high enough to fence a pasture. Land rich and cash poor, the clan lived on margins, timber to sell, fields to lease, debts to juggle. Thomas Putnam Jr. grew up hearing suits before sermons. He learned that if money is slow, law can move it. Stakes first. If you were a neighbor on the wrong side of a fence line, the Putnams could make your quiet dispute into a public case. In Essex courts, they'd pressed for boundaries, inheritance shares, and unpaid notes for years. That habit mattered in 1692 because accusations needed roots. Thomas knew the clerks, the forms, the pace. He knew which signatures made a magistrate lean forward. Action, the pattern shows up in filings. Thomas Jr. wrote and co-signed dozens of complaints that spring, a kind of accusation engine. He brought not just his voice, but his household. And Putnam S.R., sharp with local memory, and Ann Putnam Jr., 12 and central to the afflictions, formed the conversational hub of the crisis. Their kitchen became an intake desk. Girls from allied families cycled through with fits and names. Men wrote those names down. When Ann Jr. cried that a specter pinched or choked, Thomas Jr. turned that cry into paper. Meanwhile, Ann S.R. amplified detail, history, grudges folded in. The net widened the way a merchant nets a harbor, patiently, then all at once. Impact, each complaint drew constables, fees, and jail bills. Arrest strained a rival's household. Livestock went unattended, planting slipped. Confessions, often wrung from the terrified, named new people, many of whom were already on the wrong side of the Putnams in land or parish politics. The spiral didn't feel random, it felt directed. Here's a micro-story. In 1683, when George Burroughs returned to settle accounts, a Putnam had him arrested over a funeral debt. That's a line item in a ledger, but it marks a relationship. Creditor over debtor. Fast forward to 1692, and the Putnam women say his specter strangles them. The unpaid note becomes a moral failing. The moral failing becomes a capital crime. That's not witchcraft, that's leverage. Another beat. Rebecca Nurse's family had squared off against the Putnams and their allies over timber and borders. In the 1680s, they'd sued after catching Putnam men cutting on land Topsfield claimed. Those depositions taught both sides how to talk in court. When Nurse was accused, Thomas Putnam's network could meet petitions with affidavits, sympathy with suspicion. Her initial acquittal was overturned after the afflicted protested in open court. And Jr. cried and the jury reversed. A boundary dispute found its most brutal judge. What nobody outside the village saw clearly was the Putnams' cash problem. The estate of Thomas S.R. had been substantial on paper, but chopped by bequests and obligations. Thomas Jr. inherited expectations, lawsuits, and pride. He was the kind of neighbor who counted cords of wood owed to the parsonage, but also counted cords owed to him. In a year when war, taxes, and a confused charter squeezed everyone, he used the tool he had, process. There was also the matter of heirs and alliances. The Putnams married into families that sat on committees and juries. They weren't alone, other clans did the same, but they were unusually persistent. Watch the petitions that spring. When a proctor or a nurse tried to rally signatures, a Putnam ally supplied counterstatements. When a magistrate hesitated, another fit closed the gap. The household voice, mother and daughter, made the fear vivid. The family's legal muscle made it actionable. Meanwhile, Thomas Jr.'s written complaints show a wide range. Servants like Mercy Lewis in his orbit, neighbors with whom he'd traded land, rivals in parish votes. Mercy herself had fled frontier war to end up in the Putnam house, a refugee who owed room and safety to the family now naming enemies. That's a powerful alignment, trauma, dependence, and a ready audience. It multiplied accusations with a cadence that tracked with old fights. Now the court enters and the playbook tightens. Spectral evidence was contested even then, but in June 1692 the emergency court accepted it, enabled by the post-1684 power vacuum and a hurried new charter that left evidentiary standards pliable. The Putnams' words gained force disproportional to proof. Thomas's habit of paper pushing met judges eager to move cases. The result was speed. Warrants, examinations, indictments stacked like cordwood. Each step triggered costs that landed on the accused and their spouses. Sheriff George Corwin's men assessed fees, impounded goods. Families negotiated from fear. Titles cleaned under duress. Here's the impact that lingers. The Putnams didn't need to buy your farm outright. They could weaken you until a boundary agreement favored them, until a disputed road served their lot, until your heirs sold cheap. Even where they didn't gain acreage, they gained position. Rivals' voices quieted. Petitioners left jail poorer. The parish faction aligned with the Putnams set the ministers' terms. Was it all design? People in 1692 believed in witchcraft, and the Putnams were no exception. But belief doesn't erase benefit. In the ledger of outcomes, their network's enemies bore more risk and their allies bore less. That's not coincidence, that's a system. And the household at the center, a father who knew the clerk's desk, a mother who knew the village's grudges, a daughter whose suffering the court would trust, wasn't just swept by the storm. They steered it. The court that wanted specters, while the Putnams were turning fear into paperwork, the government was breaking apart and reassembling. The old colonial charter was gone. The new one arrived with William Phipps in 1692 and a to-do list longer than the coast. With jails already stuffed from months of examinations and no legislature-ready legal code for witchcraft after the 1684 charter's revocation, and before the 1692 replacement settled authority, Phipps reached for speed. He created a special tribunal, oyer and terminer, to hear and determine, and handed the gavel to William Stoughton. Stakes first. When you build a court in a vacuum, the rules you choose decide who loses their home. If the standard becomes loose enough to catch a shadow, it can catch a farm. With the province's finances strained by frontier war and unrest, velocity looked like virtue. Speed meant fees collected, dockets cleared, and the appearance of order. Action. In June, the court opened in Salem. Bridget Bishop stood first. What passed for evidence was the visible suffering of the afflicted, their bodies writhing, claiming her specter pinched and strangled. Ministers were divided, but magistrates like John Hathorne had already set the tone in pre-court hearings. Press hard, accept the unseen as proof if enough mouths repeated it. The court didn't invent spectral evidence, but it gave it teeth. Confessions counted. 2 witnesses to an occult act counted. But the reliable, repeatable currency was specter talk. Because it was always available, it traveled fast, and it named names. Meanwhile, something else was happening in Boston's corridors. The new charter had shifted who held power. Phipps was juggling military demands and political debts. Stoughton, steeped in providential thinking and allied with elite interests, was the tribunal's engine. He valued decisiveness. Every objection to spectral admissions looked, to his eye, like delay. What nobody knew at the time, or chose to ignore, was how this rule set dovetailed with local agendas. A system that privileged the afflicted's visions over corroborated facts turned social capital into legal capital. If your circle could produce synchronized fits, your enemies faced shackles. If your pastor's circle wrote careful cautions, Increase and Cotton Mather urged restraint, not prohibition, the line stayed blurry. Proceed with caution, sounds prudent, until you're the one paying jailer's fees while the court cautions its way to hanging day. This was the moment everything changed. June to August became a machine. Warrants led to examinations where the afflicted convulsed on cue. Touch tests proved diabolical influence when a fingertip calmed a spasm. Poppets and odd moles were paraded as marks of Satan. Confessors, many poor, many terrified, were rewarded with survival if they named more witches. That created supply. Each new name generated new arrests, new fees, new frozen estate. Impact: the court's design carried consequences beyond the gallows. The sheriff's office billed prisoners for irons, food, and transport. Think roughly 2.5 shillings per week for diet, enough to drain a poor family's cash in a month. When families couldn't pay, officers, George Corwin chief among them, seized goods. Even where law didn't permit forfeiture on conviction, practice bit first and asked permission later. Estate inventories paused in mid-breath. Creditors hovered, wondering which claims would survive an attainder and which would vanish with a neck snap. Unknown to them, across town, merchants were cataloging loss from the northern wars and looking for signals that the government could act. The court's pace became that signal. 20 dead by autumn, dozens still indicted, and a public whipped by spectacle. Stoughton's court allowed what steadier courts had hesitated to admit, and that permission magnified the Putnam network's voice. Accusations landed heavier when a judge was ready to stamp them. Meanwhile, clergy hedged. The return of the ministers urged caution about specters, but didn't slam the door. In sermons, some framed the crisis as a test of communal purity. That gave Stoughton cover. He could say he heeded ministers while still accepting the afflicted's descriptions as actionable. The result was a legal theater where theological debate met economic reality. Every day in jail cost money. Every conviction threatened a household's balance sheet. You'll recognize this rhythm. Lower the proof bar during a crisis, and the billable process expands to fill the gap. There was one problem the court couldn't paper over. Spectral evidence made guilt untestable. If the devil could take your shape without consent, then your denial meant nothing. If he couldn't, then specters proved a pact. The court behaved as if the second were settled truth. That assumption turned doubt into treason. Juries were pushed to see what only a circle of girls claimed to see. The ripple effect spread. Magistrates tied to elite families cemented alliances through roles in examinations and juries. Constables earned by the warrant, keepers earned by the week. The general court's absence from early lawmaking amplified Stoughton's discretion. In that gap, the tribunal behaved like a revenue and order machine, even if nobody called it that aloud. In the aftermath of each hanging day, the ledger entries mattered as much as the sermons. Bodies cut down, relatives petitioned for remains, bills presented. Estates of the executed were held in limbo. Widows negotiated with men who just condemned their spouses. The court's appetite for specters had fed an ecosystem of cost and control. And by August, the machine was starting to eat people the elite knew, like former Minister George Burroughs, on evidence no sturdier than a fit and a rumor of feats of strength. The court wanted specters because specters moved. They moved faster than surveyors, faster than Parliament, faster than a new legal code could be drafted. And in a year when power needed to look decisive, invisible testimony made visible authority. The price was paid in fields left unharvested, inventories marked, seized, and a village taught that fear could outvote fact. Who got accused V's, who got paid? While the court chased specters, the ground told a simpler story. Look at a parish map from 1692 and shade the contested edges. The Topsfield-Salem village border, the road corridors toward Salem town, the best mill access. Now overlay the arrest lists. The clusters aren't random. Names like Nurse, Esty, Howe Wild's anchor that northern belt where Putnam claims pressed hardest and timber rights meant cash. Further south, where roads funneled carts toward the port, outspoken traders like the Englishes landed in irons. The sweep of accusation followed useful land and valuable routes. Stakes first. If your farm touched a disputed line, you lived with suits, surveyors, and late-night arguments over tree stumps that supposedly marked a grant. If your pasture fronted a road the village wanted widened or redirected, your front fence was leverage. An accusation didn't need to seize your deed outright. It froze your choices. While you sat in Salem jail paying for bread and irons, planting windows passed. Creditors tapped their feet. Heirs argued in whispers. Action cross-referenced the accused with tax rolls and court petitions from the decade before. You see wealthier freeholders, families with voice, land, and grudges overrepresented. Rebecca Nurse leased a tract at the heart of a long, bitter boundary dispute touching Reverend James Allen's interests, the Endicotts and the Putnams. Elizabeth Howe's land sat in that same trouble zone, her husband long in quarrel with Putnam allies. George Jacobs S.R. owned good acreage near Preferred Path. Further downriver, Philip and Mary English, deep-pocketed merchants with extensive holdings and political clout, were named the moment the panic drifted toward town. Officials ultimately seized property and accounts tied to the Englishes, with claims totaling about £1,183, an enormous sum that functions as the smoking gun for how accusation translated into liquid asset. Meanwhile, widows with property rights, Martha Corey, Sarah Good with stubborn debts, were easy to isolate and expensive to hold. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the ledger margins. Sheriff George Corwin's office assessed fees on the accused for arrest, travel, irons, and keep. Diet alone could run about 2.5 shillings per week, modest on paper, devastating over months. If families couldn't pay, constables seized movable goods. In cases like Mary Parker's sons, cattle, corn, and hay were taken when the mother's estate couldn't be found, payment flowing from the living to settle the dead woman's bill. Estates of the executed were legally not supposed to be forfeited wholesale in Massachusetts, but practice outpaced principle. Goods vanished, accounts went balanced by force. Jailers collected from the very people the court declared suspect. The crisis had a revenue stream. Impact: who benefited? Start small. Constables and keepers were paid, often from prisoners' assets. Corwin's seizures put goods into circulation among officers and their networks. Town treasuries offset some costs with rates levied on the same neighborhoods pushing the accusations. At the parish level, faction leaders gained negotiating leverage. If your rival's estate was entangled, your claim on a boundary or a right-of-way suddenly faced less pushback. Over months, that translated into favorable settlements, road decisions, and quiet purchases at softer prices. Follow the paper. After the court dissolved, reversals of attainder and apologies slowly arrived, but restitution limped. Some families received partial compensation years later, many did not. By then, inventories had been sold, fields neglected, heirs scattered. The people who'd weathered the storm with their status intact, magistrates, friends, parish officers, creditors with patience, held a stronger hand. Patterns in deeds show transfers clustering near accusers, networks in the years after. Not a flood, but a steady seep. What nobody wanted to say out loud was that the afflicted's pointing fingers acted like a surveyor's rod. A name moved from a contested pasture into a cell, and the field's future shifted. When a jury stalled, a fit accelerated it. When a petition defended a matriarch, a counter-affidavit undermined her. Confessions extracted under duress named people already awkward in local politics, compounding the pressure. Even when acquittals came, months in custody generated debts that forced sale. Clean title likes a desperate seller. You'll recognize this rhythm. If you want to see the divide, compare two lists: who signed petitions for accused neighbors and who furnished complaints. Petitions often came from households with weaker access to the court's inner circle. Complaints clustered around men seated at the parish and county tables. That's how a community's hierarchy turned visions into verdicts. And when the tribunal finally halted, the money moves didn't unwind. Sheriff's bills stood. Guarding fees stood. Some seized goods never returned. There's a telling micro moment. After an execution day, families begged for bodies while officers presented itemized charges. Pay first, then grieve. Those coins didn't vanish. They trickled into the same small circle administering the panic. And because the province's broader finances were shaky, frontier war, the 1684 charter void and the 1692 charter new, tax rage. The witch machinery doubled as a cash machine, smoothing budgets no one wanted to defend in print. So yes, belief primed the pump. People feared Satan, but the pump delivered to familiar buckets. The map of accusations hugs contested land and high-value corridors. The ledger of payments favors the men who carried writs and chaired meetings. And the silence after, the partial restitutions, the delayed reversals, the lessons learned, obscured a practical outcome. Assets shifted under cover of piety. 3 stories make the pattern sharper. A matriarch on a border, a farmer who refused to plead, a minister tangled in debt. Watch them, and the scheme stops looking like chaos. It looks like intent. Case Study 1. Rebecca Nurse's lines in the woods. Stakes first. Rebecca Nurse was the neighbor everyone trusted, elderly, devout, a mother and grandmother whose door stayed open. But her life sat on a line that wouldn't hold still. The farm she and Francis leased, good land with timber and pasture, touched the Putnams' ambitions and the Endicott's claims, all tied to Reverend James Allen's ownership. If that line moved, a family's winter moved with it. That's why this mattered. The case wasn't only about a woman's soul. It was about who got to mark the trees. Action. Years before anyone screamed witch, the dispute was already stacked in the courts. Topsfield said one thing, Salem village another. In the 1680s, the town clan and allies documented Putnam men cutting timber where Topsfield's surveys said Salem had no right. Depositions flew. Names hardened into sides. When 1692 cracked open, and Putnam Jr. and her circle said they saw Rebecca's specter. The arrest felt absurd to neighbors. 39 risked their own safety to sign her defense. But the courtroom wasn't a town meeting. During examination, the afflicted convulsed. The magistrates leaned on specters. The narrative shifted from boundary stakes to invisible harm. Here's the pivot that shows intent. At trial, a jury first returned not guilty. It should have ended there, but the afflicted protested in open court. The bench pressed the jury to reconsider after parsing a stray phrase Rebecca had murmured, confused, partially deaf, unsure what she was answering to. They reversed. Acquittal evaporated. That's not justice. That's a decision bending toward a network that had already lost patience with her family's land position. Meanwhile, something else was happening back at the fence line. The nurse tract was leased from Allen, but its neighbors, Endicott's on one side, Putnam ties on another, stood to gain if the nurse heirs lost leverage. Execution doesn't transfer title cleanly in Massachusetts law then, but it freezes people. While Rebecca sat in jail, fees accumulated. Sheriff George Corwin's men assessed for irons, bread, transport. The family scrambled to cover costs while still planting, still arguing boundaries. A widow's plea carries less weight when constables are tallying charges at the door. Micro-story, the day the verdict flipped, Francis Nurse wasn't just losing a spouse, he was losing bargaining power. Neighbors who'd once hedged now measured whether their signatures would be remembered by men who controlled rates and writs. After the hanging, securing Rebecca's body required more supplication and money. Grief became transactional. That's how fear becomes leverage in a countryside where winter always wins the tie. Impact. In the aftermath, the nurse heirs navigated a landscape their mother had held together through reputation more than law. Petitioners had risked much to defend her, but court costs didn't disappear because a good woman died. Over the next years, as reversals of attainder arrived and apologies trickled out, restitution came halting, partial. Land around the disputed edges didn't suddenly reset. Agreements tilted. Quiet sales happened at prices softened by years of stress. The Putnam-aligned parish faction, now shown to be dangerous to cross, gained room to maneuver on roads, timber, and minister rates. What nobody wanted to write in the margins is how the timber stories mattered. Trees marked lines, wood paid debts. Catching Putnam men felling on your side wasn't just a gotcha, it was money walking. When Rebecca's name became a charge, the fight left the woods and entered a courtroom willing to hear spirits. That jump from stump to specter is the Salem trick. Turn a survey into a sin, a boundary into a moral test, then let a special court convert panic into process. There's a late echo worth hearing. Years later, when printed apologies named the wrongs, they praised Rebecca's piety. They didn't redraw the map. They didn't erase the months of fees or the bargaining away of positions under duress. A sainted memory doesn't mend a boundary won by exhaustion. Families learned that lesson the hard way. Righteousness warms no oven when the cow was seized to pay the jailer. So Rebecca Nurse's story isn't a detour into sentiment. It's the template. Put pressure on a matriarch anchoring a contested zone. Use networks to flip an acquittal into a rope. Let fees and fear erode a family's stance. Then watch the lines in the wood's edge where they were always meant by someone to go. Case Study 2. Giles Corey and the Price of Silence. Stakes first. Giles Corey was a stubborn old farmer with a big estate and a bigger reputation for not being told what to do. By 1692, he'd already seen how accusation turned into inventory lists and how a sheriff's fees could empty a barn. He also knew one thing most neighbors didn't pause to consider. Once the court called you a felon, everything you owned could be treated like someone else's problem. So when irons closed on his wrists and his wife Martha was already tangled in the same net, Giles faced a choice that wasn't about theology. It was about what his land would look like after he was gone. Action. Giles refused to plead. He stood mute in the face of a tribunal that could make spectral whispers into a rope. The court answered with a punishment so old it felt medieval, pressing peine forte et dure, designed to force a plea. They took him to the field near the jail, laid him down, and started piling weight. Boards, stones, more stones. Sheriff George Corwin oversaw the scene. Each time they asked for a plea, Giles answered with the same two words, more weight. It wasn't bravado, it was strategy. Plead guilty or not guilty, and Stoughton's court had a path to conviction. A conviction opened doors to seize, settle, or simply hold what Giles had spent a lifetime building. Silence jammed the gears. Meanwhile, something else had already been set in motion. Weeks before, Giles had moved to protect his heirs, drafting a will to root the farm to sons-in-law. He understood paper, if not the court's appetite for specters. The pressing wasn't just torture, it was a negotiation, his ribs and breath traded for a chance that his land wouldn't slide into a sheriff's ledger. Around him, neighbors watched a government that couldn't write a stable legal code for witchcraft, improvise a death that Massachusetts law didn't authorize. That tells you how urgent the machine had become. They'd rather crush an old man than confront the rules they'd bent. Micro-story? Think of Martha Corey, also accused, sitting in jail while her husband made himself a wall. If he pled and lost, she'd be a widow with a farm ripped apart by claims and costs. If he held silent, he could hand something solid to the next generation. In a year when Sheriff Corwin's men seized cattle and hay from the children of the executed to pay jail bills, that difference mattered. Giles wasn't saving his own life. He was trying to save theirs from the slow blade of fees and opportunism. Impact, the pressing lasted days. Giles died under the stones, the only person in American history executed by judicial pressing. His refusal left the court without a verdict to hang a forfeiture on. It also left a mark on the village, a crack in the spectacle. People who'd cheered examinations fell quiet when they saw boards and boulders used in place of law. Phipps would soon shut down Stoughton's tribunal and disallow spectral evidence. You can argue Giles's death pushed that door open a little faster, but the economic logic didn't end at the field. Corwin still tried to collect. The network that benefited from arrests and imprisonments kept presenting bills. Pressing didn't stop officers from assessing costs for irons, guards, and transport already incurred. It did undermine the simplest path to stripping an estate. That's why Giles's silence became more than defiance. It was a tactic against a balance sheet masquerading as a moral crusade. Here, where the price of silence shows up on paper. After the trials, when reversals of attainder trickled out and apologies were printed, the Corey land didn't become a public fund for officials to square accounts. His heirs, battered but not dispossessed, navigated a recovery that others couldn't. Compare that to families like the Parkers, whose sons saw their own goods seized when officials couldn't find an executed mother's estate. Giles had anticipated the squeeze and built around it, even as the court invented a punishment to break him. And yet, the moral of his story is that cunning beats corruption. It's that the court's power targeted property as much as people. Giles met that power with the one lever he still held, his plea, and used it to jam a confiscation pipeline that had already drained too many barns. His last words weren't poetry, they were policy. More weight meant no verdict, no clean legal pretext to turn a farm into a sheriff's marketplace. In Salem, where belief and grievance blurred, silence became both shield and indictment. The stones crushed a man, and they exposed a system that had been pressing families all along.